Okay. But I encourage you, the reason why I brought them is because they are all structured so as to provide support for you that you can use with your students as they progress through the thesis. So there are some general ones. That one in particular is associated with one of the handouts I've given you. Really, really useful. And as you can see from the roadmap, the other side of the sheet, that you can see that the way that it's structured is it's actually encouraging you to think of some of the questions that you might engage your students with. So whilst it's meant for students, you can use it. Why not? The other things are, of course, getting to grips with doctoral research and authoring a PhD. Of course, authoring is a crucial issue. Hello, come on in. I'll give you a handout. So what I was just doing was explaining the books at the front so that if you want to have a look at them later on, you can do. There is also one on professional doctorates, which I didn't bring, but those are useful as an overview. And then there are things like these, because one of the big challenges that we have with students, obviously, is they don't know how to read critically at this level, they don't know how to write. And whilst there are often skills programs for students, it's our job as supervisors to really engage them with these sorts of things. And so where supervisory teams are having to work with doctoral PhD students in particular, who maybe do not have a taught program, these sorts of books are really crucial resources for us in helping our students know where to go and what to do. And then, of course, I've included 4 books, well, 5 books, I suppose, because I love that one. It's really, really useful because it is about pedagogy, and it's looking at doctoral work as a pedagogic enterprise for us as supervisors, because it is about their teaching and learning. And some of the chapters in that are really, really good. It's on the back of the reference list. And then, of course, because the doctorate is all about writing a thesis and being able to structure an argument, one of the key things that I always push with students is to say, actually, no matter how early you are on in the process of writing your doctorate or doing your doctorate, you need to be thinking about the writing, because it is the writing that ultimately drives the whole thing. You're writing an argument. So those books I thought were quite useful. And then, of course, a nice generic one again about pedagogy, and one about doctoral groups beyond having achieved the doctorate. So have a flip through those if you're able to stay. If not, they'll be with me today, and then they're going back on my library thing. So I'm a professorial fellow in the faculty. My name is Ruth Pilkington, and I've got external supervisions, examinings, worked on supervisory teams, and also designed and run for very many years a professional doctoral program, which actually transformed the institution's approach where I was. So I think some of the things that I'm talking about have come from that, but are also addressing generic issues. My aims in running this event today were to really look at the doctoral life cycle, because I think when we're thinking about our role as supervisors, The idea is that we will be there from start to finish. We will take them through from entry into the final stages. And therefore thinking about it as a life cycle is actually quite a valuable thing to do. It is a life cycle. It's a process with transitions into, transitions through, and also transitions out into the academic field or employment at the other end. And so to think about that process in terms of the specific stages and how those might impact upon our work, and also the sort of things that we may need to focus upon as we go through our work as doctoral supervisors, is really important. The other thing I'm going to talk about is doctoral knowledge and the interesting area of modes of knowledge, which hopefully you'll find as fascinating as I do, because I think it's great, and techniques whereby you can respond as a supervisor. So, Anne Lee has written a lot on this. She's written a whole book about different stances as doctoral supervisors. But what I'm looking at here is actually where you stand in terms of your position in relation to being a supervisor. Because that will inform how you think about the process of being a doctoral supervisor, and also how you manage the life cycle. So, are you a functional supervisor? One who works with students as if it were a process to be managed? There's certainly elements of that across the board. It might be one way you are thinking in terms of doctoral study as a process of enculturation, entering a culture of academic study, which, if you're at all acquainted with the Lev and Wenger sort of ideas of communities of practice here at Hope, who couldn't be, then you will be able to sort of make that link in terms of thinking about the undergraduate degree. They're outside the academic community, you know, very much operating on the periphery and just gaining those initial skills, which may be developed further in the borders for master's students. And in fact, the doctorate is a major transition whereby our students enter the culture of academic work at its highest level as contributors to the knowledge field. And I think that's one way of looking at it. So if you think of students as entering a disciplinary community, that will change again the way you think about how the doctoral life cycle can be engaged with and managed. Another one is to think about critical thinking. Is it all about the critical thinking approach and engaging them in this higher level of study from a critical perspective? In which case your emphasis throughout will be on encouraging analysis, questioning, interrogation, the academic dialogue. Very exciting. Is it about emancipation? And here is where we're moving into maybe some of the modes of knowledge issues that I'll talk about later, where students are encouraged to question and interrogate themselves as practitioners, as researchers, as academics. Again, a different approach will be encouraged. And of course then there are the touchy-feely supervisors who are all, that's not negative at all, by the way, who want to develop a quality relationship and are delighted when their students say at the end, I couldn't have done it without you. You're the mainstay. You might question whether that's necessarily the best way of doing it, but it will again colour how you do it. But of course, go on, Namrata.
Making the student independent by developing a quality relationship with the student feels I can't do it without you.
You've not really done it then, have you? No.
That's not quality.
No. But you're right. I mean, these are questions that you need to think about. because they influence your relationship with students. So, the other thing to think about in thinking about the student life cycle is the nature of the doctorate itself. Is it very theoretical? Is it practical? Is it applied? Is it inquiry-led? And then, of course, there's the continuum of it being a PhD or an EdD, a professional doctorate, or even some of the recent work-based doctorates, which I don't think we have at Hope and certainly don't seem to have in the faculty. All of these will have an influence on how you conceptualise and how you act within the postgraduate or doctoral life cycle. And all of these will influence how you manage, respond to your students, and what you emphasise within that cycle. Go for it.
Do you mind if I have a quick question? What
Absolutely.
is the difference between the practical applied type of doctorate and the inquiry-like?
An inquiry-led may be potentially something that's a lot more about a grounded approach.
Okay.
So where it's emergent
Okay.
as a doctorate
I see.
from the experience of the
Okay.
research in practice. Whereas a practical and applied one could be the application of academic thinking to a problem,
Okay.
or to resolving an issue, or to exploring an issue, or to developing a concept.
So the both types could be just all leads to a kind of the empirical study.
That none of them are not empirical. There's got to be that, in the way that I sort of always think about a doctorate, I would
I mean, even a third
feel less happy about it not having an empirical element. Go on.
Even a theoretical research, according to me, is empirical because you're looking for literature, so there is some bit of data collection you're doing there as well.
Yeah. I mean, yes, it can be argued, but that would maybe sit very much within a theoretical, conceptual sort of framework. Whereas something that might be practical and applied would potentially place the person a lot more in situations of having to address ethical issues and to respond to the factors of complexity and shifting and the dynamic nature of research. Whereas somebody who's working inquiry-led will be deep in a work-based context potentially, or an environment where those sorts of things have to constantly be engaged with, which might mean that you have to emphasise reflexivity a little bit more in terms of giving them a tool to manage the nature of doctoral work. Reflexivity being, of course, different from reflection. Forgive me if I'm, I don't mean to. So, these are just drawings by me. The postgraduate student life cycle may involve transition into being a researcher, which may involve this early stage. And I have done that, very deliberately, because it may involve them in building up the skills and then almost sort of having to go through a process of consolidation and development as a researcher. But then these sort of peaks and troughs represent some of the crises that I'm sure you can all remember from your own experiences or are still raw in the blood. That could be life crises, or could be, conceptual crises, you name it. Or maybe your supervisor turns around and heaven forbid says, I think it's all tosh, has been done, not nice. And then, of course, that final creating identity process. Do you think that's a fair student life cycle?
Could you not create an identity without producing original knowledge? Because I think there's some sort of research identity which is created even in the undergraduates who might not be able to produce original knowledge in the sense of original knowledge created by a postgraduate student. Sorry. Did you mean researcher identity? Or
I'm talking about an identity as a member of a community of peers who are, who we are, people who have produced doctorates and contributed in some way. Yeah. But yeah, it's all a process in my mind. It is a definite, it's a series of transitions. But you see, the thing that we need to think about here is, it's all very well looking at it like that, but that's very internal. That's internal to the doctoral process. I'm sure our students do not just enter without us thinking about what's gone on before. And part of our, job is almost to engage with the way that they have actually come to doing the doctoral research, because that will allow us to actually respond to how to manage that transition on entry and how to help them develop the skills that they need to develop.
You have a plateau at the beginning and then you have those peaks and troughs. Is there a reason why you think that way?
Only because I suppose I'm just exaggerating it, but I'm also thinking in terms of, there's a really steep learning curve initially.
Yeah, but it kind of...
Which may require a lot of, and then they sort of chunter along, until they actually start doing the real meat of it. And then things can go wrong, things can go well. I mean, life can set in here as well, so there could be the peaks and troughs throughout.
Would you then therefore consider that as a more turbulent period?
I think when people start actually doing the primary work, because they're coming up against the reality of actually dealing with it. And then they're dealing with the sort of issues of maybe balancing workload. If they're part-time students, heavens. I mean, those poor people who are doing part-time doctorates, it's really, really challenging to manage to deal with all the elements.
I've got one observation, which is that I'm just trying to think about all the bit of time on this axis, the mathematician
Yeah.
who asked. And I'm thinking what the attributes might be represented on the vertical axis about the way that this research that this doctoral student is developing. It might be to do with their capacity as a researcher, their ability to deal with things critically, the development of their identity. All of those things are being on that graph, are they?
It's only a device.
Yeah.
It's not mathematically constructed.
Yeah,
it is merely a device to sort of promote discussion, which it is doing. You could look at it in different terms and you could think about, well, okay, where in that do I need to do the most input? Where in that would I need to be more of a functional, more of a managerial person as a supervisor? Where do I have to be that quality relationship person? Getting them over some of those hurdles. Because there's lots of things involved in the doctoral process, as you know from having done it yourselves. And so I think it is merely a discursive tool. Needless to say, I copied and pasted it for further discussion, because these are questions that you might ask yourselves as supervisors. Where are the greatest challenges in your mind? If you were to think of the student life cycle, where do you think the greatest challenges lie? I've done a diagram there, yours may be different, but what do you think? Any points, any ideas?
For me, actually, I think it's a cultural change in the beginning, and that's the period I would consider. I mean, there would be such big peaks and troughs, but I would think there would be peaks and troughs.
Of course there will.
Because it would be like, should I do it, should I go away, should I abandon it?
Yeah, I've drawn a mean representation.
Yeah. So I would think the biggest challenges in the beginning and then towards the end. The middle you kind of tend to survive somehow because you're just shipping along.
Interesting.
Whereas I would see it's like...
It's just...
I'm just wondering if the students cannot actually enter the process at the end of that curve, rather than us assuming that they will always start from that beginning and start rising. And again, I'm also asking where the kind of deep there
Yeah.
cannot be a deep from the supervisor's perspective than from the student's perspective. Where the supervisor is the problem and not the student.
Of course they can. But the thing is, for you as doctoral supervisors, if you're not thinking about the nature of the doctorate and the way that things might impact over the lifetime of the doctorate, because you have these students with you for 7 years, 5 to 7 years, 3 years if you've got a full-time student. Well, hey. But these things will happen, and you need to be able to respond accordingly. And to think as doctoral supervisors entering into that field and that area of work as an academic, well, what skills do I need to bear in mind? And where might I draw on things like this to sort of have a nice, convenient tool? But the thing that I think we neglect when we think about doctoral work is we think it's all about being a subject specialist who's just talking to students at a very high level and bringing them in. It is actually a curriculum process. You are delivering a curriculum. As a doctoral supervisor, you are managing a curriculum. You're facilitating it. You may not be doing the work as the student, but you have a role to play in conceptualising how that might be framed and enabled by the students. And therefore, as a person thinking ahead with your students, getting to know that student, thinking about the sort of skills that they might require, the process they've got to go through, the steps that may create difficulties and how you might respond, those are things you need to be aware of. Otherwise, you're just crisis managing. Do you agree?
I was going to say, I see this as something that aligns with the competencies that at the beginning, you don't actually really know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And so there's a real steady curve. But then when you know that you don't know something, then it gets wobbly. And you're not sure where to go next. So I see that as the bits. And then I think the crucial bit here is what support is it that translates those wobbly bits to the upward trajectory
Yeah.
again, and what can you do as a supervisor to support that move?
Exactly, which is where some of these things might be required, shifts for you, but also just being prepared as a team, being prepared as a member of a team, because there's no guarantee that the director of studies is going to be the first port of call. If you're a sort of less experienced member of a team, or even as acting as a DOS, then you need to be, aware of this and aware that students will call on different people at different times and maybe establish relationships differently.
Could you be all of those things?
Yes.
I would think of me being functional at some points and being, I mean, wouldn't the role shift within the same person?
Very astute. Yes, of course. And in fact, thinking about that actually encourages, it challenges you to think about, actually, do I have the capacity, the skills ready for myself to be all of those things and to recognise when it is appropriate? If you're approaching transfer, then by golly, you've got to be a bit managerial as well as critical, and you've got to schedule some deadlines. So I think that's where these questions about how do you support transitions, because there are internal transitions as well. So I thought of a different way of looking at it, and this is a tool that I use with students when I'm working with them to encourage them to think about it. So I don't know whether you agree with how I've conveyed it, but what it is a range of tasks. The thesis I conceptualise as being very much a thread throughout. But early on entry, you may want to allocate targeted tasks to skills build. Give them a critical read. Tell them to go out to read because that's really important, and do a summary or something like that. You've got the transfer point, you've got the vital point. Those might be sort of crucial activities that you need to acknowledge. Supervision dribbles along. Field work, when does that come on stream, when does that go off stream? It could be quite a lengthy process if you're doing a pilot and doing something quite meaty in that sense. Literature and reading, we always talk about this as being an ongoing process. And sometimes students don't think about it like that. If you were to ask your students to draw how they think this should be, you may get a very different diagram. And so that might be an interesting conversation to have. Writing, I think, has to go throughout. That's just my personal. And then, of course, doctoral development. But again, it's encouraging you to think about that process. And of course, then there's vitae, which I've copied and pasted. So, I mean, you might ask yourself in looking at that circle for vitae, what components fit in with each stage of doctoral study? You need to be aware of what the requirements are from the institution. You need to be aware of the process elements that are required by the actual doctoral quality assurance and monitoring and reporting process. But you know, it's all very well. Are you just going to let them run with this on their own? Or are you going to have some input into it? How do you define your role in relation to this? Does this university just run ad hoc workshops? In which case, how do they get to know them? If they don't run workshops and have a programme of study that will accompany this, then how are you within the faculty or within teams actually supporting this sort of activity? This might be where targeted tasks come on stream. So I think vitae is not just a tool for the students. It is a tool for you to engage with what are the skills development processes for students. Comments? I mean, of course, that's just a simple form of vitae. It's quite a complex framework, as you know, if you've been through it. Yeah? And of course, different doctoral programs might require different engagements with this, depending upon the nature of the doctorate that's being undertaken and the nature of the student. If you've got a part-timer, then maybe the personal effectiveness is really strong. I was sort of thinking about some of the Ed.D. students, for example, and thinking, well, some of those are working here at home. They could be capable people. They can organise their time, so maybe I don't need to put so much of an emphasis on that aspect. So, managing entry. The sort of things that I was sort of identifying here were things like research methods and methodology, supporting students to engage with that, engaging with the literature, scoping the research proposal, developing the writing. An awful lot of students let's hold up our hands and say, you know, I mean, at times we should be ashamed of our education system, at higher education, because if they're still writing bad sentences at postgraduate level, or not writing sentences at all, what does that make us, I mean, is it just their job? We're the experts, we should be able to direct their attention to something that will help them, even if it's only, you know, go and do a course, but to know about it and to be able to critique it and to think, well, what do I focus on when?
I'm just thinking about the international students here. They might not lack any of this, yet they might write bad sentences.
It might be an entirely different thing that comes out.
Yeah, but I mean, they often are really competent researchers.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just not saying.
No, I agree absolutely. But they may be competent within a culture that is actually not the same as the culture they've decided to enter. And that creates challenges as well. So what is your role in supervisory terms in terms of managing that aspect? Is this useful?
Yes.
I don't know whether you've discussed this sort of thing already with Alan in previous ones. I mean, I've not seen the things there. A little bit I'm getting from there. Yeah? But hopefully this is sort of encouraging you to think about it slightly differently in terms of your role. At the other end, I'm suggesting there may be a building exit velocity sort of issue to address. Because at the other end, it's about developing that profile, making sure that you've ticked the ticks, you've got the papers out there, you've got the publications, you've got the bits of paper that will back up your thesis and reinforce whatever you're presenting. So, depending on what they want to do, depending on their doctorate, you might be thinking in terms of those sorts of things. But again, the student themselves won't know this. And I think this is the crucial thing about the life cycle and your role as supervisor. At what point do you start having these conversations?
I think my support is to do the very encouragement. Yeah. Even if it's student conferences. And for me that was really valuable.
Yeah.
Just that.
How would you know as a supervisor yourself if it's your first one or two students? You know?
You can use some of the reference resources, like, for example, thinking about the student life cycle, looking at the process overall. Or, as you suggested, look at your own experience and think about, well, what was useful to me? What did I need more of to help me do it better?
It's of course subject to the kind of student you might have, but probably they'll be peaking at different points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But you need to, it's almost like as a supervisor, you constantly need to be thinking ahead and saying, well, where is my student in this? It's like any good learning thing. What's their prior learning? What's their skills raft they're bringing with them? What's their previous experience? And how can I then frame that in terms of what I know and understand about doctoral study, but also what I know needs to be done. And that's why I sort of included that roadmap, because that roadmap could allow you to sort of just spread that out on a piece of paper and start to jot down notes and say, well, this student is sitting there. They need more of this now, so that's where I've got to focus the attention and start giving them some targeted tasks to get them through that. Because it's all very well if you've got a taught programme or a programme that has taught elements, but a PhD all too often is not. It's solely the responsibility of the supervisory team with some generic input. And alongside this, of course, is the challenge for us in ref terms to think about, well, how are we generating that research culture, that postgraduate research culture? Because it all ties in as threads. It is a skein, as it were. So, that's the crucial question for you to think about. The other thing I think that is important for us to bear in mind is, and I flagged this up because it is something that I think is really important and often we don't actually engage with. Because again, doctoral study is, for me, it is a curriculum. It is a curricular undertaking. It is a learning process. We are facilitators of that learning. And there are two, and again they're referenced on your sheets. Gibbons et al. Wrote and did a lot of research about modes 1 and 2 knowledge. And those are the two top ones. Basically, they are the traditional ways of thinking about knowledge. The first one is that idea of it being done in an ivory tower and applied as a lofty gift. Transmission. Yeah, it is. It's transmission to the world out there. And then there is the one where it's slightly overlapping, and that is where academic processes are used as problem-solving tools.
Osmosis.
No, more as a problem-solving, an active problem-solving. So you take a world problem or a real-world problem or an environment problem or a work-based problem, and you apply those lofty tools of research to resolving it.
The diagram is more like in it.
Yeah. And then, of course, there is mode 3, which is about this self-developmental idea, where it is about the development of the person and their understanding and conceptual ability around the research process. And finally, we have mode 4, which is very much a critical type of thinking about modes of knowledge, and it is about change. It's very much associated with professional doctorates. It's where the person is positioned in an environment where they are being influenced by it and influencing it through research, and therefore transforming both the environment and themselves in that process. Why am I doing this? Why am I talking about this? Well, to me, this is important on two fronts. One, because students may shift as they develop their understanding of whatever they're researching. They may start out on one track and move to another. But for me, I think one of the most important initial things you need to engage your students with is encouraging them to think that right from the outset they are constructing knowledge or making an original contribution. It may not be dirt-shattering, but it may be a different slant or an insight that is novel. But unless they actually start to think about the nature of the knowledge that they are engaged with from the outset, how on earth can they start to design a project to interrogate it, or even start to write authoritatively about that? Because the thesis is an argument. And so I suggest that we as supervisors need to know about this thing, modes of knowledge, The only real place it's been written about is in Scott and Lunt's work, which is referenced on the final slide. And it's only a chapter, but it's a very concise, clear chapter and very effective one for describing it. Modes 1 and 2 is written about all over the place. But it's worth thinking about from your perspective, so that you can start to have those conversations with your students, or even within the team, in order to have them with the student. Because, of course, you are part of a team. The other thing I think of is important is that most students start up in that corner. They're thinking about the key thing they've got to do is get the research methods and methodology. Obviously they have. But so that puts them very firmly in a mode 1, mode 2 sort of conceptual framework. Whereas the actual thing they're researching may ultimately require mode 3 and mode 4. So do you pace the doctoral supervisory process to encourage the students to have that space to actually go through those cycles? Or do you try and challenge them to think about the bigger picture? You need to, this is why I argue it is a curriculum issue. And of course within that, there is the value of reflexivity, which maybe has greater requirements towards the other side of the continuum than the left-hand side as you're looking at it. But again, it is about engaging your students with a dialogue so they can conceptualise the knowledge. And I think we need to be skilled in terms of our understanding of reflexivity, because we need to be able to help them write in a way that allows that to happen. So, key points. I always emphasise that it is a writing for the thesis from the outset, that they are developing an argument, and that this should be a thought that is travelling with them as a sort of nice little thing sitting on the shoulder right from the outset. It is an entry into a community of peers, and that must colour the way you talk to your students and the way you engage with them. And part of your challenge may be constructing those peer conversations, but at times it may be actually being parent to child, but more towards the latter end, of course, peer-to-peer, so that they can engage with the Viva properly. And how do you direct energy to meet life cycle challenges? So you may be manager, facilitator, listening ear, role model, doorkeeper, challenger throughout the doctoral process. I coloured the references so that you could sort of look at them as being a sort of staged element. So the blue ones are sort of generic things, and then there's the general writing stuff, and then there's the green sort of central activities, and then the final thing, which is a lot about writing. A lot about writing, because I think it is the writing that really is what matters. So, that's the doctoral life cycle, and thinking about yourself as a supervisor in terms of managing the curriculum. Questions or reflections? Go.
Obviously then there's a responsibility here, and you really need to reassess whether you're ready for this. Sorry.
Of course you are, Namrata. Of course you are.
My search, I'm just generally thinking that this is really something which requires a bit of analysis of your own capabilities.
But you are in a team. You are in a team. And nobody in this room will be working solo.
True.
And that is important. So part of your thinking is about, well, where do I fit within the team? Okay, I might be a bit, reluctant initially because I'm lack confidence or something.
It's like messing the student.
You're not. Never.
No, I mean, I just got one observation and one question actually here. I agree with what Namarchi just said. I think this is a huge responsibility to the student and also to yourself, your own kind of the professional development. But at the same time, I'm thinking actually it's something we all ought to work towards because that is, part of our identity. So that's just a comment. The question is to do with the workshop, this session title. This is supporting students through their life cycle in a professional sense, professional way. But I mean, we focus on very much, about their life cycle during their doctoral study. I'm thinking is there extension to that?
Of course there
and
is.
then how much you as a supervisor should have a role to play, after they have passed their revival. Because, sometimes, as you mentioned in your last slides, actually, and the supervisor sometimes could be a very important gatekeeper, and particularly for those who want to get into academia. So I feel like there could be a secret, sequel after the session, what you could do and what you couldn't do in terms. But that's kind of my thinking. I don't know if you're kind of suggesting this life cycle you're mainly focusing on is during the doctoral study rather than as a general life cycle, the professional life cycle.
I mean, you're making a really, really valid point. It is part of a bigger process. And I think sometimes we don't actually think about that. And we need to as a community. Because as a whole, we should be seeing our undergraduates or our master's students engaging with their, with the doctoral students, engaging with the profs or, the subject profs, and really getting that sort of sense that there is a progression and there is a trajectory in that. Because that is about how new academics enter the field more often than not. And certainly how I think it is conceptualised within this institution and in ref terms. So you need to think about that. You need to think about that as well because of course we're trying to involve our students in research right from the day go, the starting point. But yes, you do have a responsibility at the other end because the viva is very often not the finishing point. They will come out with minor mods or major mods and, there will be a responsibility to help the student to progress that. I suppose what might be a useful activity for you is to reflect at this point on where you feel you might benefit from particular things that you want to work on or particular aspects that you might need to develop yourself. Because you are entering a community yourselves. You're not expected to be an expert right from the outset. And therefore, as third supervisor, or second supervisor, I suppose, you might just be supporting, but you might have particular strengths within a supervisory team. So it's important to have that conversation with your peers to try and get a sense of, well, where do you see me or my contribution in this? There might be an area that you could very specifically work with the student on. Or there might be a contribution that you can make very, very validly as a subject expert. But you need to constantly be thinking and framing your contribution in those terms.
I think the roadmap which you just showed as an example could be quite useful too, even for the supervisory team, just looking at what a milestone at a given stage.
Yeah.
And I think that's something I would definitely consider using myself.
Yeah, I think it's a phenomenally useful tool. Any other thoughts? Any key points that you've been able to draw from this that you think are particularly valuable? And the reason I've done it globally is simply because each one will be different.
I think this idea that you might have to emphasize a different or adopt a different role at different stages.
Yeah. I mean, it is an interesting one actually. It just sort of prompted me to think as I was saying that. We have a supervisory log that our students write. But where's our supervisory? It's almost sort of incumbent upon us to think, oh, what would be the study plan?
Sure.
And maybe there is an opportunity for us to think in teams. You know, do we think about a study plan around the student program?
I would suppose that in EdD part of that comes from the structured program they have. I mean, it's definitely not there for PhD, but the study plan would be there in the EdD, and then the VTI framework would probably provide some sort of framework for.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of, I know it's not supposed to be that way, but there are certain targets to be achieved by certain
Yes.
time, and
It's
that will-
helpful.
And so therefore, I mean, if you use it constructively rather than ticking the box, I think it could really work well as a framework to develop the researcher in terms of creating an identity.
Yeah.
And it's part of that professional record keeping, which is not because you need to keep it, but also that's what we do as academics now, you know, through our academic careers, but probably not without a framework.
Yeah.
So that's providing them the framework and getting them into the mode of being an academic in that sense, though they do that for research purposes.
Yeah.
But that can then apply to any part of their professional lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I think the study plan probably comes from there.
But all too often, you know, I mean, VTI is regarded as almost like a stick and a box ticking exercise. And I think if you can transform that into a constructive, positive tool.
Yeah. I think it requires a proactive rather than a reactive approach to using
Yeah.
it.
And I think all too often this is the challenge. As supervisors, we are not proactive, but we are reactive.
Yeah.
And I think, if anything, I would want you to take away the message that as members of a supervisory team, it's incumbent upon us to start to be a little bit more proactive in the way that anybody designing a curriculum has to be. What's the end point? Where are we getting? Where are they coming from? How do we take them through that journey?
I think that definitely should be the director of study taking a leading role in working that one out.
It may be, but at the moment, directors of study don't come on programmes of development, do they?
So because they have different kinds of programs.
They don't have programmes of development.
Sure.
So where does that conversation happen?
Good question. So making me start to worry because I'm starting to have a student in 2 weeks' time thinking, you know, should I?
I think there's a proactive approach. You come up with a plan and give it to the director of studies.
There's an awful lot of value for a new supervisor asking the simple question,
Yeah.
you know,
And getting a surprise.
before or after, and sort of saying, well, do we have a sense of where this student is coming from and how we might structure the PhD around this particular field of study?
I think it's often useful to have an inexperienced person because they're always thinking ahead because they don't know what's coming, so they need to plan more than the others who've probably gone through the process. So I think it's always useful to have somebody who's not done it before because they never get comfortable with the process.
Yeah. So this is telling you that, in fact, one of the most useful things you can be is a novice supervisor.
Yeah.
True.
I think there's lots to learn from people who are new to the process.
Yeah, because those, the DOS has been there, done that, sat on it.
Yeah.
They're
And they
coming
start
from
getting it.
Mm.
a position where, well,
Yeah, because they've seen it all and they're fine with it.
Yeah.
I think the nervousness helps.
they may not realise some of those challenges and they may not be as aware. Any other thoughts? In that case, I hope that has been useful.
Thank you. That's
Have a look
really
at
useful.
those.
Thank you very much.